Welcome everybody on this very now dark Monday afternoon. My name is Matthias Risse. I'm a professor at the Kennedy School, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Lea Ypi, who is an associate professor in political theory at the London School of Economics. She is also a co-editor of the Journal of Political Philosophy. She was born in Albania, and we quickly agreed on the way over here that she is probably Albania's most distinguished living philosopher, possibly Albania's most distinguished philosopher ever. She studied in Rome and Florence, spent some years in Oxford, and then went to LSE. She is currently visiting the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin and is suffering a bit from an overdose of sausages, as she told me. She has worked very widely in topics in political philosophy, such as immigration, ideal versus non-ideal theory, the past and ongoing wrong of colonialism, territorial rights, many other topics, some of which I use to great benefit in my teaching. Her article, What's Wrong with Colonialism, was recently included in the Philosopher's Annual for 2013. Her first book, Global Justice, an Avant-Garde Political Agency, came out in 2012, was published by Oxford University Press. I'm just going to read you a few lines from an early review of the book. So this review says, this book is a terrific contribution to the literature on global justice. In fact, it is one of the most exciting contributions to the field in recent years. Lea Ypi offers a fresh defense of global egalitarianism, embeds that defense into a penetrating discussion of philosophical method, and proposes an intriguing account of the connection between political theory and practice. She makes illuminating use of historical material and draws rewarding analogies to debates in the philosophy of science and in aesthetics. This book takes political philosophy as the culturally and intellectually interconnected enterprise that it should be. It's a terrific review, I should know because I wrote it, so I recommend to you both the book and the review. She has another book forthcoming, which is called The Meaning of Partnership with Jonathan White with Oxford University Press next year, which is also concerned with the connection of political theory and practice in a slightly different way. It's a spirited defense of political partisanship. Mind you, political partisanship as distinctly different from political factionalism, so we look forward to seeing that book. Lest you think that she is unduly narrow, she is actually also at work on a book on teleology and Kant's first critique as we speak, but this is not going to be the topic for tonight. The topic for tonight is structural injustice and the irrelevance of attachment to resources. Please join me in welcoming Lea Ypi.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the Safra Center for having me here. It's lovely to be at the center. It's also lovely to be at Harvard, which is a place I'm very attached to. But I can't tell you more about it because it would undermine the claims that I'm going to make in a few minutes. So it's a story about love and attachment, and we can talk over it over drinks. I also want to thank very much Matthias for the flattering introduction, though I often wish introductions were outroductions, so things that are given after a paper is given, so that you can make your own mind and someone says what they think about the speaker. But anyway, so this paper is called Structural Injustice and the Irrelevance of Attachment. And I want to start with an example from a newspaper story from a couple of years ago. In August 2013, an Australian mining company was fined about 150,000 Australian dollars for desecrating a nearby rock, which was said to belong to the Kunapa people, an indigenous group based in the Australian Northern Territory. The mining company was actually not digging at the rock, so in the side of the rock, but the digging of the mine basically caused the explosion of the rock and its splitting in two parts. And the indigenous group, the Kunapa people, claimed that the explosion had made it impossible for them to recognize the site as a traditional site to which they were particularly attached. In fact, the story was that the rock was part of a traditional songline telling about the fight between a bandicoot and a marsupial, right? Now, don't ask me what a bandicoot is, but it could be something relevant. So they claimed that this was an insult to their attachment to the place and to the role that that place played in their collective memory. Now, many people seem to think, and I agree, that the verdict of the Australian courts in that case was right. So the Kunapa people had been wrong in some non-negligent way. Their sense of attachment to this place was clearly disrupted it was probably true that they could no longer recognize the site and it would no longer continue to play the same meaningful role that it had played in their lives before. And many people seem to think, and this is the part where I disagree, that the reason the Kunapa people were wrong was that their sense of attachment to the place had been disrupted, and so that something that they loved had been taken away from them with no possible remedy. So what I want to do in the course of this lecture is to talk a little bit about first what attachment is and why we might think it matters, and why people who write in defense of indigenous claims to land and resources tend to think that attachment to these places matter. Then I want to go into the reasons why I think attachment doesn't matter, and why the only reason, or the most relevant reason, that I think we have reason to pay attention to the claims of the Kunapa people, or like claims of indigenous people or formerly colonized groups, that have to do with claiming a particular use of external objects, has nothing to do with the fact that these groups are attached to these objects, though attachment is descriptively relevant to explaining their relationship to those objects. I don't think it matters normatively. So the reason I think we do have to pay attention sometimes, and I will explain in a minute what this might mean, so when we have to pay attention to these special claims over the use of external objects, is when these claims are made by members of groups that are victims of what I call structural injustice. That is to say, victims that might have suffered from historical injustice in the past, and the effects of such historical injustice are still present in the lives of members of these groups. Then I'll say something about what I think structural injustice is and why it matters. I will examine a few objections and then I will conclude. So let me start by saying why attachment theories, as a way of ascribing agents particular claims over the use of external objects, might be thought to be plausible. And the reason they are offered as plausible accounts in the literature has to do with the fact that they seem to differ from two other accounts which we tend intuitively to find implausible. So the first one is a kind of conventionalist account that says that distributive shares over particular external objects are the result of institutional convention, broadly speaking. By institutional convention here I mean some kind of procedure on which agents settle, and the outcome of that procedure is what establishes what agents are entitled to. Now, conventionalism, which is incidentally a view that I subscribe to, and it's called, my favorite version of that view is called global democratic conventionalism, is thought to be a flawed view because it seems to fail to give an answer on the question of why it is that particular agents can have or can claim access to particular objects. So alternative views that are not conventionalist in this way and that blame conventionalism for not giving us an account of why particular agents are entitled to particular objects tend to take the form of either desert-based theories, so I can explain why I'm entitled to a share of a particular object because I deserve that object, or labor theories or some kind of other Lockean theory. And of course, the challenge for those who subscribe to these alternative, more historical, let's say, theories of distributive justice tend to be accused, when you examine the issue from the point of view of indigenous people or members of colonized groups, for putting too much emphasis on the productive interaction with particular objects. And so there, the challenge and the critique of this Lockean account is that, in fact, if we think about productive interaction with certain objects, far from explaining, for example, the wrong of something like colonialism or removal from particular lands or taking away of particular resources, in fact seems to justify it. And this was historically, traditionally, the justification for colonialism, the fact that, for example, indigenous people didn't interact productively with the land and resources that they had access to. Now, attachment-based theories of special claims over the use of external objects seem to try and overcome this challenge by putting the emphasis not so much on productive interaction with these objects, but on attachment to these objects. And the idea is here that external objects play a non-trivial role in group members' life plans, and to interfere with such life plans would mean to deprive these members of access to resources that are valuable to the pursuit of those life plans, to in some way set ends for these agents that are not theirs, and in doing so imposing an alien way of relating to these resources, and that seems to interfere with this agent's autonomy. So the source of the wrong in this case is interference with an agent's autonomy, interference with their freedom of choice, and attachment seems to give us an account of what it is that links particular objects to particular agents, because it's, after all, the objects that these agents claim access to. Now, one interesting thing with attachment-based theories is that they say that the theories are ultimately individualistic theories. So they don't place emphasis on cultural rights, for example, or on rights of particular groups to exist culturally, and therefore they're individuals to have non-reducible rights to objects that might be culturally relevant. So these theories of attachment are individualistic in form, and I will follow that individualism here. So I will agree with them that we might think that what is valuable about giving access to special objects to members of these groups has nothing to do with the irreducible value of the culture that characterizes these groups, and rather we are concerned with individuals, and therefore we are also concerned with the group's rights as a derivative right. The second qualification that typically attachment-based theories of access to resources and objects, I call them objects more general rather than resources, because I want to get away of the debate of what is a resource for a particular group. So I'll just speak about objects more generally. So the second qualification that these theorists make is that the value of the culture is something that we could, of course, appreciate, but it has nothing to do with what in the theory actually subscribe this value. So again, there's a detachment here. And what they also say is that we might make space for these particular claims, but of course there will be distributive constraints on those claims. So non-instrumental relevance of culture is repudiated, and also the idea is that the claims that the theory makes could be defeasible. That is to say, that could be overridden by other distributive constraints. Let's say constraint based on need, for example, or constraint based on desert, or proviso principles, or full-blown egalitarian requirements. So the idea is that the theory of attachment is quite flexible in that sense. And again, I will agree with that theory. The point is, though, that these attachment theories want to say something special about the relationship between particular objects and particular agents that is in some way similar to what I called earlier historical accounts of justice, that is to say desert theories of labor theories, that gives an answer to the particularity question, that is to say what links particular agents to particular resources, but that is also able to explain why these claims can be singled out as opposed to some other claims to some other object. And I think at the end of my paper it will become clear that I don't think the particularity question can actually be solved. And so what I try to suggest in my paper is to give up on the attempt to respond to the particularity question, to acknowledge that the reason particular agents end up with particular shares is just a result of convention, that there is a contingency to conventions. Sometimes conventions are justified, sometimes all we have to do is to acknowledge their arbitrary source and try to improve them to the extent that they affect our present day justice and the possibility for future justice. But there is not really much more than we can say about the source of particular conventions, and so I think we have to give up on the particularity claim. Another clarification that I need to make about my argument is that although here I will criticize attachment-based theories, I don't have a lot to say on a positive view of how we might justify particular distributive shares. That is to say, we could be open about which theory of distribution we prefer, and as I said, I have my preferred theory and I'm happy to talk about it over question time, but it doesn't, nothing I say here hangs on subscribing to that particular account of distribution. And the claims I make in the paper are mostly critical. They are intended to show that one particular way of linking agents to external resources, that is attachment-based theories, fails, and that without committing necessarily to a better way of thinking of how we might actually distribute. Just the claim is merely critical. And again, even though I will say at the end of my paper that what matters if we do sometimes link particular agents to particular resources is the present day condition of justice of the groups that these agents are members of, that is to say structural injustice in the present, I don't want to suggest that structural injustice provides us with a defeasible consideration of every time overriding alternative concerns that we might have. Say that another alternative group in society has equally pressing claims, there's no reason on my account to actually favor members of structural injustice. The question is a question of democratic adjudication, I think. And I again don't want to make the strong claim here that structural injustice always trumps. I just don't want to make the claim that structural injustice does trump attachment. So that's the sort of more limited account. Another thing I want to say finally, just before sort of scene setting, is that I think this argument will be more appealing to people who are committed to end state rather than historical accounts of justice in distribution. And I don't want to go into the second year undergraduate called the difference between end state theories and historical theories of justice. So I will just assume that everyone is familiar with that distinction. And what I want to suggest is that the conclusions of my paper might also be used heuristically if you really resist intuitively what I'm going to say about attachment and a bunch of other historical ways of thinking about claims to resources. If a reader or a listener is ultimately unpersuaded, it probably means that they are much more committed to historical theories of justice than they initially thought that they were. And incidentally, I also think that this is what attachment theorists are doing. So even though they would say to you that they're somewhere half in between end state theories and historical theories of justice, putting pressure on the argument from attachment, I think, is a good way of seeing that what they actually really do subscribe to is a version of historical accounts of justice in distribution. Okay, so let me get to the why attachment fails, why attachment-based theories of access to external objects or special claims on access to external objects fail. So let me say something first about what we might consider a special claim over the use of a particular object. Here I intend the definition of what a special claim is to be quite general. What I mean is to have a special claim to an external object means to be able to access the object, transform it, use it for particular purposes, and not really having to account to other agents for how one uses that. So including, for example, the sale of that object and deriving an income from it. So it's a relatively general claim. And these attachment-based theories are often, for example, used to make us reflect intuitively on the condition of members of, as I said, for example, indigenous groups, who might claim a special way of relating to particular objects, including, and I'm sorry for calling animals objects here, but for example, for how members of particular groups need to have access to certain hunting techniques or hunting practices. One example is the case of the Sami people, who is an indigenous group of Ugro-Finnic descent, who are under an exemption to hunt reindeer. So reindeer hunting in Scandinavia is prohibited everywhere except for the Sami people. And the reason is that hunting reindeers provides an important way of thinking about their way of life, and it's something that these agents are attached to. The reindeer hunting is one way in which we understand them to have historically always operated in the past, and so we recognize that the significance of this practice to their way of life, and therefore they are given an exemption. Now, my question is, why are the Sami people special? So why can a normal Swede not hunt reindeers, and on the other hand, a member of a Sami group can? From a democratic theory perspective, or just from a sort of broadly equal opportunities and rights perspective. And I don't think the argument on attachment gives us a good reason or a good answer. So the argument from attachment says these agents are attached to these objects. These objects play an important role in their life plans. To deprive these agents of access to these objects would be to disrupt those life plans. Now, there are a lot of other cases in which we don't seem to have as much trouble in depriving particular agents of particular objects that are central to their life plans. And I want to give you another case, which is the case of fox hunting. So, people who are familiar with the UK culture and practices might know that fox hunting was a practice that was very much live in the UK aristocratic circles and culture for about 300 years, until it was abolished in November, I think, 2004 by the Labour Party through a bill that was very much resisted by the House of Lords and supported by the House of Commons, and in the midst of a lot of controversy, including very live protest movements on the side of members of aristocratic groups, for example. So there were a lot of complaints by the Countryside Alliance, which was the pro-fox hunting group, which claimed that to prohibit these groups from hunting foxes was to unduly favor an urban style of life, which they associated to the House of Commons, interestingly not to the House of Lords, as against the rural style of life, and the hunting of foxes, they said, was extremely important to these groups, and yet the British public and the British House of Commons didn't seem to have trouble with that. In fact, there was a referendum a couple of years after the fox hunting ban in the UK, and an overwhelming majority, about 70% of the British public, said that they were still very much in favor of the ban, and in fact a lot of people said that they agreed with Oscar Wilde's definition of what fox hunting was about, which was something like it's the favorite sport of the English country gentleman, who is the pursuit of the unspeakable, of the uneatable by the unspeakable, or something like that. So what I want to suggest with the fox hunting example is that there are often cases where a certain practice seems to be crucial to a certain way of life, and to groups pursuing and continuing to pursue that way of life, and yet the argument from attachment which they give, and which they gave in the case of fox hunting, is clearly to consider to be irrelevant to the decision of a democratic majority of citizens, which thinks that, for example, hunting foxes is a cruel practice and it should be banned. Now my question is, why is it that if we only focus on the argument from attachment, why is it that the hunting of foxes is wrong and the hunting of reindeers is right? Some people might think that the argument and the answer comes from, for example, sustenance. So the fact that reindeers are crucial to Sami Scandinavian people diet, and so that they need the reindeers for their life preservation in a way in which the Brits don't need foxes for their life preservation, or the British upper classes. But that is not the case. That is not the case with many exemptions. In fact, it's not the case with the Scandinavian Sami either. It's not the case that the Sami could not have any other kind of nutrition, that there are no other sources of food available in Scandinavia, and so on. To take another example, which is the Inuit case from the Canadian indigenous people, the Inuit are again exempted from the practice of chasing seal pups and selling their skin. So there is a European Council ban on the selling of products that are derived from the hunting of seal pups, on grounds of cruelty, and this ban was very much favored by animal rights activists. And yet here the exemption is made for the Inuit people. And this is not a case of sustenance, because the Inuit, although they also use seal pups for sustenance, the main claim on their behalf is that this is an economic activity that they need. Apparently you can make handbags and jewels from seal pup, and so they claim that they are being deprived of the income that they could derive from the sale of these traditional products. So again, and interestingly enough, if you ask animal rights activists who are in favor of the ban, and you look at their reports on the claim, they would say, oh, we were absolutely in favor of the Inuit ban. And so although they were campaigning in favor of this ban in favor of the European Union decision, they actually say that they also did not mean to disrupt traditional indigenous activities and ways of life. So my question here is the following. What is it that makes us think that members of indigenous groups are special? And the answer that attachment theorists would give to this question is, it's the fact that they're attached to these objects. And my further question is, well, if we only think about attachment, and if we think about the value that certain resources, objects, land, play to the way of life of a particular group, then there is absolutely no difference between the Inuit claim to seal pup hunting and, say, the Queen's claim to Balmoral Castle, and we're not troubled, or the aristocratic claim for continuing to hunt foxes. So if we only base our consideration on attachment, then there's a range of reasons we might have for inserting the ban of particular practices, and we would still find these reasons plausible. So what is it that makes us worry more about the case of the Inuit and the Sami than about the case of the aristocrats? Now, before I go into what I think the real reason is, I want to talk about the possible objection that there could be to this analogy that I've been running between the upper class preferences and the preferences of particular indigenous groups. So one argument, one counter-argument might be the fact that, for example, the chasing of reindeers or seal pups is crucial to a whole way of life in a way in which hunting foxes is not to upper class representatives or members of particular upper classes. So it's a whole culture that is oriented around, for example, certain hunting and fishing practices, and that is not the case with the culture of aristocrats. Now, I could also make an argument about how this analogy is actually valid, and I think it only takes 2 or 3 novels from the 19th century to be convinced that there really is something to an aristocratic culture in a way in which there is something to an indigenous people's culture, in the way in which people perceive themselves, who they hang out with, what kind of life they have, how they think about their relationships, how they think about social positions, and so on. But the argument here could also be different, because remember, theorists of attachment don't actually want to put emphasis on cultural claims. So they say that the reason we value certain cultural claims is the relevance of this culture to individuals and to individual life plans. And so if we think about, regardless of what we make about the possibility of having something like an aristocratic culture, which I think is also perfectly plausible, if the argument is about the disruption to individual autonomy and individual life plans, in the case of the Sami people and the Inuit people, and in the case of the fox hunting English aristocrats, I think the cases are completely analogous. And again, to think about how disruptive certain distributions might be on members of upper class representatives, think about the pages or the movie from Dr. Zhivago, where at some point, you might recall, I hope everyone's seen the movie, at some point Yuri comes back to Moscow and he finds the house that they've been living on forever, which was a 5-star house, has actually been taken over 3/4 by the agricultural college. And you might remember the scene where Yuri comes in and he sees this house being completely taken over by the Soviets, and his wife says, "Oh, don't worry, we'll be fine. I know it's going to be a bit disruptive for the beginning, but they actually needed this space and we had to give up. We had a really big house anyway, so why should we not have shared?" So now remember, if the argument is about attachment and about disruption, it is the case that some ways of life and some practices are disrupted by some distributive interventions, and yet we don't worry about them. I want to qualify this. We do worry about how sudden that disruption might be, for example. We might worry about the violence with which certain changes are made. So in the case of the aristocrats, you might say, yes, it was fine to dispossess Marie Antoinette, but maybe we shouldn't have executed her without due process or whatever, something like that. But the point is that it's not the distribution per se that concerns us, and it's not so much the argument on attachment that seems to persuade us otherwise, that we should, because these individuals hang on to these resources and are attached to them and they play an important role for their life, we should actually, they get to keep them. So, what is the difference then between the English aristocrats and the indigenous people? So the claim I want to make is that the difference is the fact that one group and members of one group have always been in charge of the rules, have always been contributing to the making and reproducing of a system of rules that was imposed unilaterally on other groups of people without these groups having a say on how these rules were made and kept, and without actually having these rules ever been used to their advantage. And the difference between the English aristocrats and the Inuit is that the Inuit, on the other hand, or the Sami reindeers, or any given indigenous groups that you might think about, has actually always been on the receiving end of an endless chain of murder, persecution, injustice, exploitation, and so on, which continues to have effects on their present life, that is to say, on the life opportunities of members of these groups. And so I think that it's this consideration that intuitively makes us think it's more likely that the Inuit and the Sami are right and do have a special claim to the use of particular external objects, and other groups who have, as I said, perpetrated these unilateral systems of rule that were imposed in an unfair way, however one want to characterize that unfairness on other people, their claims don't seem to have the same force. And this distinction, which is I think a crucial distinction, is lost on theories of attachment. So if you only place the emphasis on how a system of rules or how a pattern of distribution interferes with agents' autonomy and their sense of attachment, we lose the distinction between what is different between these two groups. That is to say, the fact that one group is on the producing chain of injustice and the other one is on the receiving end of the chain of injustice. And I think this is the reason why we are sometimes, and I'll now in a bit explain why it is that this is sometimes is the relevant consideration there, sometimes entitled to have a special say on how particular objects to which they are attached as a matter of contingent empirical fact is valid. And so why it is that they get to keep objects that they say that they are attached to, and why it is that don't think aristocrats get to keep the objects that they say are attached to. So to think about this analogy, and think about first the analogy. So the analogy is that the cases are similar, both groups are attached. The distributive intervention upsets both life plans of both kinds of group members. The autonomy of both is in some way interfered with, and this is because there is a majority of citizens which is in a conflict about these claims and which has to say that trumps these special claims. Now, what is it that now connects the fact that these groups are on the receiving end of a chain of injustice to these special claims over external objects? So, to now connect the relationship between particular objects and the structural injustice I've been talking about, think about a thought experiment. Imagine you have two neighbors, so call one Nora and one Victor, and Victor has for a number of years bullied Nora, let's say. So Nora has been for a number of years forced to work for Victor, do things that Victor arbitrarily claimed for her, sometimes kicked out of her house, sometimes kept in, sometimes Victor let her do things, sometimes he didn't, and so on. Now suppose that after a few years Victor has a change of heart and there is a common space that they are now allotting. Now, while Nora was being bullied by Victor, she never got to have a say on how this common space had to be used. So Victor, let's say, liked to always plant vegetables, he sold these vegetables, he made money, he never gave anything to Nora. So this common space was never actually used in favor of Nora. Now, suppose that Victor has had a change of heart, and now it's Nora's turn to decide how this common space is going to be used. And Nora says, I've had enough with planting vegetables, I think I'll just like to grow flowers. I don't think it matters to decide the case in favor of why Nora gets to have a say on how particular activities are pursued, that Nora is actually attached to the flowers, or that the flowers play an important role in her life, or that the activity of flower growing is in some way more important to Nora than it is to Victor. I think we would grant Nora her claim on the use of the shared allotment, even if we didn't know anything about the flowers, even if we didn't know that Nora is attached to flower growing. I think we owe it to her as a result of the fact that Nora has been for a number of years a victim of injustice, and that for a change now Victor doesn't have a say and Nora has a say. And that means that Nora has a special say on how this common space is used, without us needing to know anything about what reasons Nora has for claiming access to that space and claiming a special way of using that space. So we don't need to know anything about Nora's attachment, we don't need to know anything about Nora's activities, and so on. And in the same way, I think, we would say that when we are discussing the claims of indigenous people, for example, or members of formerly colonized groups, we owe them a say on how particular resources are, or particular objects are accessed and what use is made of them. Just because these groups and members of these groups have been on the receiving end of a series of injustice, just like the bullying case with Nora, and now we owe it to them to have a say on how particular activities ought to be pursued, and we're no longer in the position to tell them that they should not do this. So I think the reason we are more inclined to give special members of particular indigenous people a special say on these resources has to do with the fact that these groups and members of this group are victims of what I call structural injustice. So, let me say something about the view on structural injustice that is at the heart of this account. So, a structural injustice, as I see it, is a kind of injustice that is perpetrated even in the absence of a living agent who is responsible for producing the injustice in the first place. So, there doesn't need to be a living agent who is directly causally responsible for that injustice. You have an injustice when a system of rules reproduces that injustice by the way in which these rules are favoring certain agents, social positions, distribution of resources, advantages, and so on, and disfavoring others. So a structure, as I see it, is a set of rules that is recursively implicated in the reproduction of social systems, and that both presupposes and creates certain pattern constraints on agents' social position. So if we think of a structure as something like that, so a structure is a system of rules that produces certain patterns, both in the origin and in the way in which these patterns continue to be carried over, we would say that structural injustice is a kind of injustice that is suffered as a result of the imposition of this system of rules in the lives of particular agents who might be members of groups who suffer from structural injustice. That is to say, groups that by virtue of the way in which this system is reproduced and perpetrated are always on the receiving end of disadvantage, and so somehow they never or very rarely manage to make it out of their group membership in receiving certain advantages and so on. So, as I said, structural injustice then, what it does is that it kind of indicates a series of pattern constraints on agents' advantages, opportunities, resources, and so on, such that the continuing of the lives of these agents is hindered by this social structure that they inherit and in which they find themselves. I think it's not very hard empirically to see actually the effects of structural injustice, and I think people who are in Harvard or Oxford or LSE know this all the time when they do admissions, right? So we see that these admission files, they always come from particular social classes, and we worry that members of particular groups don't have enough access to the educational resources or opportunities that we offer them. I remember when I did admissions in Oxford, we were always worried that we never seemed to get candidates from a particular postcode in England, and we got very, very happy when we once received a candidate from one postcode which had never applied to Oxford for 50 years or something. So it seems that a structure can generate disadvantage and injustice even without an agent necessarily intending for that injustice to be produced and replicated. So we don't need to have a causal agent responsible for it, and yet you can have groups, and empirically it seems to be the case that we have groups and members of particular groups that suffer from this structural injustice and from the disadvantages that are related to their group membership. And I think members of formerly colonized groups or members of indigenous groups often fall in this pattern. So they often are on the receiving end of structural injustice by virtue of their membership to these particular groups. Now, you might say, okay, so what is the exact connection between structural injustice and the fact that members of these groups actually make claim to special use of particular objects? What is the exact connection? And so the claim that I make is that the access to special objects and to the particular use of external objects is only relevant and should be granted to the extent that this access helps remedy structural injustice. So the claim that I make is that to the extent that a group says that I need resource or object X, and we think that it might matter to remedy the condition of structural injustice in which members of that group find themselves, then we ought to grant them this claim. Now, the fact that these groups are attached to the object doesn't matter at all from the point of view of our theory. It's only descriptively interesting to see why it is that these groups are claiming access to this particular object. So it's descriptively important that they claim access to objects that they're attached to, and they don't claim access to objects that they're not attached to. But from the point of view of my theory, or my account, the idea is that we have reason to grant these claims only because they are claims that come from members of these groups, and not because of the relationship between members of these groups and the external objects. So, just to make the case more controversial, if the Aboriginal people, instead of claiming a special use of the rock, which was called Two Women Sitting Down, I just remembered, this rock that was split by the mine, instead of claiming access to that, say they claim access to the Sydney Opera House and free tickets for the opera, I would say that we have the same reason to grant them these claims if we think that granting these claims would remedy their condition of structural injustice, and that of course it would not produce further injustice in society, so it would not make an equally worse off member of a group even worse off, let's say. So if the overall balance is that by granting a say to, or a free ticket to the opera house rather than a say on the use of the rock, we could actually remedy structural injustice, I think there is, the claim is equally plausible. Now, of course, people won't make claims to things that they're not attached to. So maybe the Aboriginal people won't claim tickets to the Sydney Opera House. Maybe they'll continue to claim access to particular objects that they're attached to. But as I say, the point that they do that just gives us an account, a descriptive account of the reason they have to be attached to these objects, rather than the reason we have to think that that attachment actually matters. Okay, so that's one answer, and what that answer suggests is that ultimately the particularity argument, which I started with at the beginning, which theories of attachment seek to solve, and the attempt to explain why particular agents who are attached to particular objects also have a say on those objects, I think fails. And in a way, particularity is not really a problem that can be solved by the theorists. So the reason why people end up with particular distributive shares can be varied, and there could be different grounds on which we adjudicate on these reasons. And attachment could be one of these grounds, it could not be, it's not something that we can decide on first principles. So if attachment doesn't matter at all, if granting access to special object is conditional on overcoming structural injustice. Second objection might be, what if there were other, even more effective ways of overcoming structural injustice? So something that members of indigenous people and Aboriginal groups don't see themselves, something that we know would actually really improve their conditions. So let's say if the problem is that these groups are unlikely to go to university, what about giving them better opportunities? What about be giving them, or if the claim is that the health is poor in the case of members of these groups, better health opportunities, and so on. Should we go with something that we think is more effective and more likely to fight structural injustice and to remedy structural injustice than granting members of these groups a special say on these objects? So I am actually inclined to agree with that, but I want to highlight a few troubling features of that perspective of saying we should decide what it is that remedies structural injustice. And I think to see what is troubling about that perspective, to which I'm sympathetic, but I'm also willing to be talked out, so I'm very happy to discuss this further in question time. Think about, again, the Victor and Nora example that I gave you earlier. So suppose that now Victor has had a change of heart, and Nora gets to have a say on the shared use of the shared space, and we think that this is important because it's conditional. It's important for Nora to reacquire her sense of dignity in a neighborhood, so the fact that she's no longer bullied by Victor means that she will have greater sources of self-respect, let's say, and so that the neighbors will think better of her than they thought when she was constantly bullied and so on. And I said at the beginning that it doesn't matter to settle the case in favor of Nora having a special say on the use of the shared allotment, that Nora is attached to a particular activity, say flower growing. Now, we would say, okay, what if it was better for Nora to not grow flowers, but to actually plant vegetables like Victor has done? In fact, Victor says to Nora that after he's had a change of heart, he would advise her that it would be much better for her if she actually grew vegetables rather than planting flowers. Because since Victor has shaped the preferences of the neighborhood, planting vegetables is a much more lucrative activity than growing flowers. And Victor knows this because Victor was crucial in how the neighborhood preferences were shaped. And it would be furthermore true that were Nora to devote herself to growing vegetables like Victor has always done, it would be much better for her and for her position in the neighborhood to do that. Now, as I said, I think this is an interesting symmetrical case, because I would say that I would at least personally be inclined to agree with the fact that yes, maybe sometimes what we tell members of indigenous and former colonized groups to do, what we think is better for overcoming structural injustice, might well be what is objectively better for them to overcome structural injustice. But I think it should trouble us that what this means for the view that we are advancing is replicating and reproducing the same kind of underlying values, preferences, and the same choices that were at the heart of the system of rules that structural injustice is reproducing. So, in other words, what it means is that Victor decides what is a valuable activity, And he tells Nora, and I think we would be right to see that as an instance of just a kind of benign manipulative situation where whoever has been on the producing chain of the injustice tells members of particular indigenous groups what it is that they should really do in order to overcome that injustice. And the reason I think it should trouble us has to do with the different ways in which we might think structural injustice is remedied. So in one option, one alternative set of responses would be to say that what victims of structural injustice really need is actually economic resources and opportunities for them to just be on a par with other citizens in society. And perhaps granting a special claim on the use of resources is one way in which, by, for example, being allowed to pursue traditional activities like fishing and hunting, this is how members of indigenous groups make these resources, and this is how they contribute to economically, and so this obviously helps them in one way, right? So economic income, increasing economic opportunities, and granting special access to particular objects might be relevant to increasing those economic opportunities for members of these groups. A second way in which we might think structural injustice might be remedied is by giving members of particular formerly oppressed groups a special say in political institutional structures. That is to say, a special say sometimes means a group differentiated voice. Sometimes it means semi-sovereign powers, for example. So this is a kind of empirical case-by-case basis where we think that a structural injustice might be remedied further by dissociating the former colonizer by the victim and just letting the victim for once make decisions in the way in which they think they should make decisions. So in those cases, sometimes granting access, special say over the use of external objects might be instrumental to that sort of response. A third way in which we might think that the connection between having special claims over the use of external objects and remedying structural injustice is made by thinking about the symbolic value of the recognition of certain groups' preferences, including cultural preferences. So sometimes it might help that society recognizes the importance of particular claims to the use of external objects to members of particular groups. As I say, the fact that we think that this is symbolically important doesn't mean that we have reason to think that it's valuable to be attached to these objects, or that in fact attachment trumps other considerations that we might have. So the symbolic recognition is in this case instrumental to, for example, restoring the sense of lost dignity by members of these groups, and also to making them rethink the historical relationship with other groups by which they have been formerly colonized or dominating. And so in this case, the value of recognizing special claims to external objects is of pure symbolic importance, but sometimes recognizing the symbolic importance of these claims is actually important instrumentally also to remedy historical injustice. So this comes to near the end of my talk. So what about, one might think, what is the relevance of historical injustice in this account? I have emphasized the importance of recognizing certain claims over the use of external objects by thinking about the relationship between granting these claims and exemptions, for example, that we don't grant to other citizens in society, and the relevance of that exemption to remedy structural injustice. That is to say, injustice that is suffered in the present by members of particular groups. So what is the relevance of historical claims? Well, I think you probably gather that I would say it's none, in as much as historical claims are made qua historical claims. So I don't think we have any reason to worry about the injustice that, for example, Spain suffered by France during the Spanish succession wars, which were very bloody, happened 300 years ago. Eventually France recovered. In fact, eventually France needs to help Spain. I don't think there is anything special to historical injustice other than thinking about the effects that historical injustice produces on the lives of members of currently oppressed groups, or groups that are, as I say, victims of particular historical injustice. So in a way, history is important, but again, it's important because this is what tells us where this injustice came from, and it tells us about the generation of political institutions which have path-dependent effects on the lives of particular agents in society. But history, I don't think, matters as such. In fact, I want to make the further claim, which is that a member of a formerly colonized or indigenous group is no more special than a member of a currently oppressed group. So, to go back to my example of the Kunapa people in the Australian territory. Suppose that now the Kunapa people are making this claim to the rocks and to the special use of the rocks, and there is also a recently arrived group of Somali immigrants who also claims access to the rocks of the Northern Territory. Which of these two should we favor of these two claims? I don't think we have any reason to favor the indigenous claims over the recently oppressed group, except insofar as we might have to think about feasibility, except insofar as we might have to think about further injustices produced in society, except as we might have to think about the relationship, the current relationship between different groups. And so these are all considerations that have to be part of a process of democratic adjudication. I think as such, there is no difference between a currently oppressed group, if we think that group is really oppressed, and a formerly oppressed group, if we think that group is formerly really was oppressed and is continuing to be oppressed. If the claims of these groups are equally pressing, if the grounds on which they might want to have remedy over, we might want to remedy structural injustice are equally pressing, I think attachment doesn't matter to decide the case in favor of one group over the other. I think the two claims are equally valid and both need to be part of a process of democratic adjudication. So, as I say, again, there's nothing special about the rocks, nothing special about particular indigenous groups claiming access. What we have to worry about is the effects of past injustice over the lives of, the present lives of members of these groups. So just to wrap up what I just said, I started by talking about the way in which we think attachment-based theories might help us decide between conventional, this sort of end-state theories of justice, and this in-between version that is attachment-based theories that have some kind of historical component, and current conventionalist theories of justice. I introduced the reasons why we might have thought that attachment was an appealing ground for granting special claims to the use of external objects. I then introduced some reasons for why we don't often think that attachment trumps other distributed considerations, and if we only hold on to claims based on attachment, we will not see what is special about the case of formerly colonized or indigenous groups' claims to land and objects. What is really special and sets these groups apart from other groups which might be otherwise favored in society is how they are doing currently and how they position themselves vis-a-vis what I call a structure and the injustice that a social structure might be perpetrated. And I tried to bite as many bullets as I could just to make the case as sharp as possible on attachment. It may well be that you will be still skeptical of the fact that this is a complete dismissal of attachment-based theories. And in that case, as I said, I hope the value of this argument is still to show that perhaps we are more committed to historical theories of justice than we think we are when we are deciding on how to adjudicate between end-state theories and historical theories of justice. If we really resist this argument from attachment, if we really resist these claims that I've been making about the fact that indigenous people could be claiming anything, the fact that other currently oppressed groups can be making the same claims and have the same values, then perhaps we are more inclined, though I'm not, but you might be, inclined to agree with historical theories of justice than with end-state theories of justice. But I will leave that to you to decide. Thank you very much.